Subnautica is a game where you explore a vast underwater world teeming with life, both friend and foe alike. A game created despite numerous challenges at the offices of developer Unknown Worlds Entertainment, with the studio almost going bankrupt on multiple occasions. But despite its tricky development process, the game was a massive commercial success, with the latest sales figures available from 2020 showing Subnautica had passed 5.2 million copies sold. With numbers like that, a sequel seemed like a no-brainer, but Subnautica Below Zero, much like its predecessor, would not have an easy development, with the game suffering from design and story changes, a pandemic, and a mixed fan reception. This is the story of the development of Subnautica Below Zero, so sit back and relax as we melt through the icy surface to unveil what exactly was going on at Unknown Worlds Entertainment during the game's development. Below Zero was initially planned as a DLC to the original Subnautica, so it comes as no surprise that the game's life would start just as Subnautica was reaching the end of its development. Subnautica would officially release out of early access on Steam on January 23rd, 2018, but the very day before this release, game developer Charlie Cleveland had sat down for an interview with Rock Paper Shotgun to discuss the game's future post 1.0 launch. The concept of an ice biome had been something that had been discussed at Unknown Worlds for some time, but hadn't yet made it into Subnautica. Charlie would say at this interview that while plans were not yet concrete, they were about 80 to 90% sure they were going to make a paid expansion for the game, and that current plans were based on an ice world. Brainstorming for the DLC would begin about a month after Subnautica was fully released, and on February 13th, 2018, we would get our first look at what would eventually become Below Zero through footage uploaded to YouTube. The appropriately named Pingu video was uploaded by one of Unknown Worlds developers under the channel name Sulek, and shows what can only be described as very early concepts for the icy world of Below Zero, along with a number of penguins. They are not quite the finished game's penguins, but you can see the inspiration. On the same day that Pingu was released, the legendary video was followed by the critically acclaimed Pingu 2, along with two other videos showing early concepts for the glow whale and the rock puncher. But after dropping a few bombs, our hero then went dark. Months passed with no new information. Were these actual concepts or just a bit of fun? In July of 2018, we would get a few more teasers, as Alex Reese, a concept artist working on Below Zero, would post a number of art pieces on his DeviantArt page. Some of these you might recognise, but others would remain only as concept art. After all this teasing, on the 30th of August, the suspense was finally ended, and Subnautica Below Zero was officially announced to the world. In the months between the first sneak previews and the announcement, behind the scenes attitudes had shifted at Unknown Worlds. The Below Zero DLC was now set to be a standalone experience that would take place after the events of the original Subnautica, with the game being developed in a similar fashion to the original, through early access and community feedback shaping the experience. This shift from DLC to standalone title was a purely business decision, as evidence the company had gathered showed that standalone games sell better than downloadable content. But this change in format didn't affect any plans the company had in relation to the game's story or scale, which remained unchanged. Key features suggested at this early stage of development were a focus on temperature management and a voiced protagonist, which was a large contrast to the original Subnautica's quiet exploratory form of storytelling. After the game's initial announcement, again there was quiet, but then our hero would once again emerge from the darkness. Starting on the 6th of September, Sulek would upload more in-progress footage to YouTube. These videos would show a number of work-in-progress and possible features, experimenting with concepts that could have one day made it into the game. These would range from tiny craftable phase gates to deployable drills and more basic features, such as base colouring and renaming. If you look in the background, you can also see some of the work-in-progress terrain and buildings that would eventually become Outpost Zero. My favourite of these videos are the ones that show the work-in-progress Seatruck, which didn't have its final model and looked a lot more blocky than the final version we would see. Come on modders, restore the Seatruck to its former glory. We must return to Cube. Around this time, Alex would post another collection of concept art to his DeviantArt page, showing prototypes for the Arctic Peeper, the Mighty Chelicera, and others. For the next few months, there wasn't much in the way of new information, but then on the 25th of January 2019, we had our first flash of real news. Unknown Worlds announced that there would be a special Subnautica livestream event in just 5 days' time, showing the game's trailer and launching the game into early access on the Steam, Epic, and Discord stores. But amongst the rejoicement from fans, there was bad news for console players, as the game's early access wouldn't be coming to PlayStation or Xbox for the foreseeable future. On the 30th of January 2019, the first early access build of Below Zero would be released, alongside the early access trailer. This trailer showed a number of the final designs for creatures we would see in the full game, with the debut of the glow whale, penguins, and the brute shark, as well as the ice worm. We would also catch our first glimpse of a new vehicle, the Snowfox, which seemed to have replaced this hovercraft from the game's concept art. But while we had seen the ice worm and the Snowfox, neither of these were in the playable version of the game at this point. Looking back at this version of the game today, it was surprisingly complete. Obviously there was still a lot that needed to be done and it was rough around the edges, but many of these environments appearance aren't too different to what we would see in the final build. The twisty bridges were in, Delta Island was in place, and Outpost Zero was surprisingly better maintained than it is today. Lots of creatures were around too, with the penguins, glow whales and brute sharks all present and accounted for, along with some placeholders taken from the original Subnautica that would later be replaced. This first version of the game contained all the music from the original Subnautica, but didn't include any new or exclusive Below Zero tracks. This might be because the original Subnautica composer, Simon Chalinsky, who had been working on the DLC, had been fired in February of 2018 over controversial tweets. Below Zero's new composer, Ben Prutney, had been brought on board in December of the same year, and it's possible he simply hadn't had time to get any new music created by the time of the January launch. On a side note, Ben actually live-streamed himself making some of the game's music using the strangest instrument I have ever seen, which also happens to be called a waterphone. You just couldn't make this stuff up. In the developer's own words, this build of the game was full of bugs, ran poorly, and included only a small amount of the game's final features, but they did have their experience from Subnautica to call on, and a secret weapon. When making Subnautica, the developers ensured they got the community feedback they needed by adding a feedback system directly into the game. Pressing F8 or escape would give the player the option to send a message straight to the developers. This feedback screen would also give the player's location in the world, helping the developers find the location of any issues. Over time, clusters and patterns emerged in these reports, and heat maps were generated where players were running into issues. This allowed the developers to target improvements in problematic areas where the most issues were occurring, and also let them see where positive feedback was being received, so they could replicate it and improve the wider game. Using the data they had from the feedback system, they could also add new stories as you progressed, as they knew what equipment and vehicles the player had at any given time. By measuring what vehicles or oxygen tanks the player had, they could see how deep the player could dive, so they knew which parts of the map you could reach and loot. For example, the Sunbeam missions would only start after you had a working radio, and they used the game's depth mechanic to progress the story of the infection. The deeper you go, the worse it gets. This system was directly imported into Below Zero, and would allow the developers to see which parts of the game were working well and what needed to change in future updates. They also recreated their public development board. This page hosted on Favreau allowed anyone to see the developer's roadmap and where the game was going, so they could give feedback on features ahead of time. On the 4th of February 2019, not long after the game's initial release, the developers started to upload experimental builds to Steam, where players could play the very version the developers were working on that day. There was no password, and you could just download and play whenever you felt like it. These builds were full of bugs and game-breaking glitches, but let the developers have feedback in real time from playtesters. The game's first full update was released on the 8th of March 2019 and brought the Seatruck to Sector Zero's seas. Or should I say its skies, as this funny bug shows how placing an item in the Seatruck made it fly into orbit. This version of the game also included a number of other features and map changes, bringing the deep twisty bridges and thermal spires to the game. This was also when those cheeky little sea monkeys were added, and we can't forget about the squid shark either. Alongside this update, Unknown Worlds released a short promotional video, an idea they originally stole from Valve, who did the same thing with Team Fortress 2. Unknown Worlds had used this idea previously in the original Subnautica, and decided to do the same with Below Zero. Moving forward, all the major updates would get one of these mini videos showcasing its key features, which was great for the game's marketing. By the 24th of April, Unknown Worlds were tired of just unintentional things floating, and decided it was time to bring the previously teased Snowfox into the game for real. And while it might not be very useful now, as you can just brute force your way through the game's land sections using the prawn suit, back then it was the only land vehicle available. Well, as long as you didn't use console commands, as this update added the prawn suit blueprint, but it required reinforced glass to craft, something that wasn't in the game and would later be cut completely. There was also a pretty funny bug with the Snowfox, where if you died while driving, you would respawn back at your base. Well, at least the top half of you would. Your legs, on the other hand, would still be stuck to the Snowfox, stretching your body across the map. The Snowfox update also let you interact with glow whales for the first time, so petting and riding glow whales was very much in fashion. The update also brought the Calycerate to Sector Zero, a creature previously teased in Alex's concept art, and in my opinion the most important Leviathan in the game, as it's the one you encounter most frequently. A month later, the 5th of June would see James Bond come to 4546B. The Spy Pengling update added a very cool, if limited use, remote-controlled robotic pengling to the game, allowing you to fit in with the herd and gradually work your way up the social ladder until you became the undisputed ruler of the Penguin Kingdom. Okay, so maybe I made that last part up, but you definitely could create the Spy Pengling. The Spy Pengling was actually a community idea, so if you ever want to see evidence of the benefits of the early access development model, this is it. This update also brought our favourite stationary friends, the Vent Garden, to the game, along with the tree spars biome they sit in. Temperature was also added at this point, so after getting rejected from the penguin colony, you could realistically simulate the shunning of society and being forced forced out into the cold, although luckily it wasn't yet possible to freeze to death. At this point, good progress was being made, however not all was going smoothly at Unknown Worlds. On the 11th of July, a statement was released addressing the game's roadmap. The problem was the roadmap had become so large and unwieldy that members of the team were starting to feel under significant pressure to complete areas of the board within their given time frame, even if these weren't critically important. The roadmap was like a hedge, wild and growing in multiple directions, causing the team to feel bogged down in work that they weren't even sure was needed at that moment in time. This resulted in members of the team undertaking the dreaded gaming industry crunch of working to hard deadlines every 6 weeks or so, leading to burnout. Moving forward, the studio announced that the roadmap would only be used for highlighting what was to be released in the near future, allowing them to work on the game's critical features in an order that made sense, and not creating work for work's sake. Having sympathy for your rejection from the Pengling colony and subsequent force into the cold, on the 17th of July, Unknown Worlds dropped the Arctic Living update, bringing the cold suit for your protection along with the new large room base piece and glass ceilings, and to cheer you up even more, they even made a little jukebox to soothe your soul, from which you could play your own music. This was also when the prawn suit became craftable, and consigned the Snowfox to not much more than a quirky distraction. 2 months later, on the 17th of September, Unknown Worlds would be back with one of the game's most iconic updates. The Iceworm update finally brought its namesake into the game, along with the Frozen Leviathan excavation site and the Arctic Spires biome. We also finally got the bioreactor, so you could take revenge on the penguins that disowned you by turning them into fuel to power your base. But we also got something new, a story rework. In this update, all the previously recorded audio for the story was ripped out of the game, and the game's story rework began. This was set to introduce more tension to the game's opening scene, but nothing was concrete and this was all text-based for now. As a consolation prize, the storm that featured at the start of the game was now turned into a cool new meteor shower, similar to what we would see in the final build. You might have noticed that so far I haven't discussed the game's story, but this is where the real difficulties would begin. Throughout Below Zero's early access period, a story and narrative have been created and expanded with each update, but even with the original rework already underway, on the 22nd of November 2019, everything changed. Unknown Worlds released a statement saying they were happy with how the game was shaping up, except in one key area, the story. Unknown Worlds had wanted to create a living story with Below Zero, featuring a speaking protagonist and other voice characters, in stark contrast to the silent and more exploratory nature of the storytelling in the original Subnautica. But the developers deliberately chose this style to differentiate the two games. But Unknown Worlds had been having trouble defining their characters' true motivations and getting the community to care what happened to them. A short time before this statement was released, in October, the game's writer Tom Joubert had left Below Zero to pursue other projects. Tom said on Twitter that he wanted to focus more on indie projects and that Subnautica was just getting bigger. Tom had worked on the story for the original Subnautica and was responsible for creating much of the universe that we'd come to know and love, so this was obviously a huge blow. I was curious to see if there was more to this situation than had previously been revealed publicly, so I reached out to Unknown Worlds to try and get a response. Unfortunately, they didn't respond, but I also reached out to probably the most important person in all this, Tom, the game's former narrative lead, and he did respond. And what he said reveals a lot more about what was happening behind the scenes at Unknown Worlds at this time. At this stage in development, Tom had produced about half the game's story. A bare-bones first draft of all the main story beats was in the game, but other pieces to give added detail were still required, with some scenes highly developed and others still needing a lot of work. And this is where things were starting to go wrong. Internal company feedback around the story wasn't particularly glowing, from what I can only assume was data gathered from the game's feedback system and fans on social media. Tom was happy with his story, but management at Unknown Worlds wanted to rework key parts of the plot in order to satisfy unhappy fans. Tom then became bogged down rewriting key early and mid-game scenes in an attempt to craft a narrative that was better received. But in the end, all the problems had started to stack up. Tom's original vision for a fun story had become plagued by rewrites and worries of sequelitis. Tom would eventually leave the company in what he described as a mutual breakup. Neither he nor the company was getting what they really wanted, and the whole situation was causing Tom a lot of stress. He knew at the time that leaving would likely result in major changes to his original story, as any new writer has to make what they inherit their own, with Tom citing changes to the PDA's voice and Marguerite's personality as changes he feared they would make once he left the company. Ultimately, Tom had just become sick of the problems that this particular project had been throwing his way, and would cite personal and ethical differences along with a lack of financial incentive to continue to work for the studio. Although he did give me the disclaimer that these are all normal issues in game development, he thought the team at Unknown Worlds was great, they just weren't in the position to pull out all the stops required to keep him at the company. Following Tom's departure, Unknown Worlds swiftly brought in Jill Murray as the game's new narrative designer. Jill had previously worked on Tomb Raider and the Assassin's Creed series, series, so had plenty of experience under her belt. But after lengthy internal discussions at the company, the decision was made to rework the story they were already in the process of reworking, and that the next update, Deep Dive, would be the final version containing this narrative. In retrospect, this actually turned out to not be quite true, as after Deep Dive, the final update featuring the original story was the Lost Ship update, but for all intents and purposes, this was the end of the original narrative. To skip forward in time for a second, Jill would release a post on the 17th of April 2020 talking about how Unknown Worlds approach storytelling. Essentially, any narrative content was split into lots of tiny pieces and chucked all over the seafloor to allow the player to explore and experience the story in as unlinear way as possible. This was complicated by the game's speaking protagonist, but they didn't want this to railroad the player too heavily in one direction. The design of the game's story itself would involve lots of internal discussion around how characters should behave, how cinematics can be used effectively, and what kind of gameplay mechanics could be used to keep things interesting. These discussions weren't just internal, and the team would also reach out to external experts for help and advice. After a cycle of discussions, Jill would produce diagrams to help map the game's direction, and once new meetings had been held, more diagrams would be produced. And over time, these debates would naturally shift away from brainstorming and towards refinement of what had already been agreed. But the problem Unknown Worlds now faced was how to tell a new story in a world they'd already built. Many of Below Zero's environments had already been created, which meant any new story was going to have to be moulded around a foundation that had already been laid. There simply wasn't time or money to rip up everything and start again, and neither did they want to, as much of the world was already great. The Deep Dive update was released just 5 days after the statement about Below Zero's future on the 27th of November 2019. This would bring the terrifying Shadow Leviathan and the Crystal Caves biome to Below Zero, along with the Cryptosuchus and Marguerite Midas base. This update would also see a new voice for Robin brought to the game, replacing her original British voice actress with another different British voice actress. This was because the original voice actress was not available to record new lines for the story, which might sound a little strange, but keeping staff employed for long periods of time is expensive, so typically recording is done in one session and then these staff move on. But due to the game's extensive rewrites, they needed to go back to the recording studio, and as the original actress wasn't available, the decision was taken to replace her with a new voice. The 17th of December would see another update on the console versions of the game. The plan was still to launch on all consoles simultaneously once early access was complete, and Unknown Worlds were working on improving their in-house efforts to do this after working with Panic Button and Grip Games for the ports of the original Subnautica. This would require major improvements to the game's technical infrastructure and was taking significant effort and time to achieve. This was the end of any updates in 2019, and the next release, the final major update with the existing story, took place on the 19th of February 2020. The Lost Ship update brought the wreckage of the Mercury 2, a missing spaceship, to Below Zero, along with beautiful nighttime auroras and other minor changes. The final build for the original story would be released on the 6th of March after some final polishing, and with it closed a significant chapter in Below Zero's development. Maybe we can say this story froze to death, as this was the first time you could actually die from the cold. I will now cover a brief breakdown of the original story. I won't cover every detail and change, but hopefully this shows just how comprehensive the rewrite yet to come truly was. This version of Below Zero begins at Outpost Zero. In the full game, this location is completely destroyed, but in this timeline, this place is in full working order. Robin and a team of other scientists have been conducting research on 4546b after the events of Subnautica. The key players in our story consist of Robin, her sister Sam, and a man named Jevov, also known as Jeff. As our story begins, Robin awakes to the sound of blaring alarms, as a meteor storm showers the planet, threatening to kill everyone in the area. She needs to evacuate to an orbital research station called the Vesper to ensure her safety, which just so happens to be where her sister is. Unfortunately, Jeff seems to have disappeared at just the wrong moment, so Robin needs to go and grab him so they can get off the planet's surface. It turns out Jeff has woken something up in the Architect base they were studying, and a booming alien voice at the entrance of the facility implies that it might have done something unfortunate to him. As Robin leaves the area and chaos unfolds, someone seems to have launched the only ship they have to get off the surface. Maybe Jeff is still alive after all. With Robin now stuck, she will need to shelter at the next best alternative, the research base where she started. Well, so much for that. With the base destroyed, Robin is forced to enter the water and swim to safety, and Sam sends down an emergency life pod from the Vesper. This reflects much of what happens throughout the story. While in the Below Zero we know today, Sam is missing and presumed dead, in this old version of the script she is very much alive and providing help throughout the game by sending down aid from orbit. Later on, we have an almost carbon copy of the scene where Robin meets Alan in the final game, but initially Alan is a lot more hesitant to trust Robin than in the final build. Robin and Alan, now existing in the same skull, continue to explore the planet, and while trying to repair a radio antenna to re-establish contact with the Vesper, Vesper, run into Marguerite Mida, a survivor from the original Subnautica, which pretty much plays out how it does in the final game. She tells Robin not to follow her, and that's about it. After some more wandering, Robin finds Jeff's crashed ship outside a lab in the glacial basin, meaning he must be nearby, and eventually Robin traces his signal to a door in the ice. Inside the bunker, Robin finds a log from Jeff saying he's still looking for Alan, as he doesn't believe he was destroyed in the meteor storm. Eventually, Robin finds the frozen Leviathan and sends samples of the bacteria covering its body up to Vesper Station for analysis, using a rocket launched from Delta Island. She does this as this was meant to be extracted by other researchers, but this was delayed by the evacuation. While this has been happening, Robin has decided to hide the presence of Alan from her sister, as she is unsure what she or Altera might do if they discover the truth. But there is a growing sense that Sam knows Robin is lying about something. Shortly after, the Vesper manages to contact Jeff. He's alive and says he's decided to stay behind to try and look for the architect. He's ordered to stand down by Sam and wait for a dropship to pick him up. He agrees, but sounds somewhat reluctant. As Robin continues to navigate the seafloor, she ends up finding Marguerite's hidden base. Upon entering, Robin notices that Marguerite has the tablet required to access the facility she was studying at the start of the game, but she's not really keen on the idea of sharing it. But maybe if Robin helps her get off this planet, she might think about giving it to her. The main plot thickens further when the Kara sample sent by Robin never arrives at Vesper Station, and then not long later, the only samples of Enzyme 42 on the Vesper also disappear. Robin must now find a Sea Emperor to get more in case of an outbreak, and after securing a sample, she again sends this into orbit, but a strange force field destroys the rocket before it can reach its target. It turns out our friend Jeff isn't actually our friend. He was the one who destroyed the Enzyme 42 samples, and now he has released the Kara Robin sent skyward onto the people aboard the Vesper, demanding the station withdraw to seek medical assistance or they're all going to die. He wants Alan, and he knows that Robin has him. The Vesper's director orders Marines to storm the planet. They want the last living architect and they need the Enzyme 42. But unfortunately for them, the shield blocks them from landing, so there's nothing they can do. Alan reveals he knows a way to deactivate the shield from a facility inside the planet, although he doesn't seem to particularly want to, as Jeff's actions have protected you from Altera. While all this has been going on, much like the final game, Alan wishes to have a new body, and Robin has started to help him by scanning the various parts needed to construct a new one. The construction process plays out pretty much how it does in the final build of the game, and at this point the pair have to reach the mountain facility to disable the shield and save Sam, and this is where the playable story ends. But there are some leaked unfinished assets which reveal the original ending. Marguerite gives Robin the white tablet needed to get into the facility, likely in order to set some kind of ambush for your mutual foe. Robin and Alan head inside, and it's revealed that Alan has a way off the planet without needing to disable the force field. He's just going to leave and let the humans destroy each other, but Robin pleads that he must disable the shield in order to save Sam. Alan says that he could disable the shield remotely if he knew where Jeff was, but he doesn't know where he is. Robin begs Sam to give her Jeff's location, and once she does, Alan disables the force field. But with the sky now clear, a gunship full of Marines arrives at the facility trying to kill Robin and capture Alan. And just as all seems lost, Marguerite and her modified prawn suit sweep in to save the day, hijacking the ship and taking the crew hostage. Marguerite agrees to take some Enzyme 42 samples to the Vesper as she leaves the planet, and like in the final game, Alan and Robin travel to the Architect homeworld. Now, I'm not going to break down all my issues with the final version of Below Zero's story in this video. In fact, I've already covered some of that in the first Subnautica video I made on this channel, so if you want to see that, then you can go and watch it. But I'm going to slightly break the timeline of events here and say this story is way better than the one we got in the full release, and knowing what I know now from researching this topic, I can see why. So much of what made it into the final version of Below Zero is taken from this story. In fact, lots of Tom's favourite lines made it into the final game, but this story actually has rational characters and relevant environments. The frozen Leviathan has a purpose, Marguerite has a purpose, there's actually stakes on the line here, whereas in the final cut of the story, the frozen Leviathan seems pointless as it's just a side objective. You don't even need to destroy the Kara samples to complete the game. So Marguerite's inclusion in the story to destroy an Altera research lab containing other samples is also completely pointless. Sam's death is irrelevant as it's part of this optional story chain, and Robin can even leave the planet without ever finding out what happened to her sister, which was Robin's entire mission at the start of the game's new story. This shows the issues that occur when you change a story so far into a game's development, and then you have to rewrite a story around assets that already exist. Vesper Station has pretty much disappeared from the final build of the game in what was originally a pretty big part of the plot. It can still briefly be seen in the game's opening cinematic as a repurposed generic satellite, but apart from this, you'll never see it again. In retrospective, I think changing this story was a huge huge mistake. All the things that Unknown Worlds wanted to fix by changing the story, like making you care about the characters and be interested in their fates, was completely trashed in the rework. In fact, personally, I think they actually made the problem worse, because the original story seems a lot more coherent and frankly more interesting. Okay, now let's get back to the chronological timeline of events. Not long after the final story build was released, on the 30th of April 2020, the first build of the new story would arrive. The Frostbite update had our protagonist launching from a ship in a drop pod as meteors rained all around them. This new action-packed opening had our hero smash to the floor and straight into the action. This update brought us the Glacial Bay and a major rework of the Glacial Basin. The developers admitted they were having trouble with some of the game's land-based areas and were trying to make them feel more connected to the game's typical underwater environment. Later, they even had to add new holes in the land to make sure you could get back to the water more easily, as players were getting stuck spending too much time on land and away from the core watery gameplay. This update also added snowballs which you could throw at snowstalkers, and plenty of other minor quality of life updates, improving the UI and unlock methods for basic tools. However, implementing the start of a whole new story did throw up another problem. As this version of the game was so different to what had come before, this update would break any save files from older versions of the game, forcing players to either keep playing on their old saves or rip the band-aid off and start a new adventure. This was fine on Steam, as you had the choice of what you wanted to do, but for non-Steam players there was no choice. When the new story dropped, your old save was unplayable, and there was no option to roll back. But aside from the technical issues with trying to implement a new story, Unknown Worlds had another problem: recording the audio for it. This stage of Below Zero's development was taking place as the pandemic was beginning to ramp up. Unknown Worlds staff are based all over the world, and most had been working from home for some time, so general development continued with minimal disruption. But the real problem was getting the new story's audio into the game. The audio recording studio the developers were using was based in the UK, and the country's lockdown rules had caused the studio to close. Originally, Robin's first two voice actresses had been British, along with her sister Sam, but as of this build they were no longer present in the game, and they were replaced with American alternatives. The reason for this was that the developers felt that Robin's second voice didn't fit the new reworked character they wanted to portray with the new narrative. All these recording problems meant Robin and Sam had some in-game voices, but pretty much nobody else did. So for the next few months, the game's story was mostly text-based, but at least the intro had audio. By this point, we now had our third version of Robin's voice, and our second for Sam. Personally, I prefer Robin's first voice, but, you know, maybe I'm biased. But this does show the problems that occur when undertaking so many script rewrites. They also renamed the sisters from Robin and Sam Goodall to Robin and Sam Are You, probably to draw a line under the old timeline. On June 25th, we would see the Salad Days update, with changes to the many stations and bases scattered across the planet, as well as improvements to Marguerite's greenhouse. The rocket launch site previously sat on Delta Island was replaced with the far less epic communication relay, and all the other bases were given a destructive upgrade to make them look abandoned. The game also saw improvements to its environments, with the glacial forest being added at this point. We also got the Glacial Basin Bridge, so you could get some air with your Snowfox, and gained the ability to study dead iceworms by looking at their giant bones in the iceworm graveyard. Strangely though, we lost the intro audio we got in the previous update, leaving us with this very long and awkward silent intro scene, as the developers again wanted to change the dialogue in this scene. The 13th of August would see the Stranger Things update dropped, which I could only assume is a reference to the Stranger Things TV show. It appears this update was named after the signals found in your PDA which pointed towards alien artifacts. Overall, this update was mostly polish, adding achievements, more jukebox discs, lore information that could be found in the world, and general graphical improvements. This was also when the original PDA voice was changed to the new version found in the final build of Below Zero. Just 5 days later, a new trailer would drop on the Subnautica YouTube channel, announcing that Subnautica and Below Zero would be coming to the Nintendo Switch. This was actually a major achievement, as many at the studio had initially thought that getting the game to run on Switch was impossible due to hardware limitations, but after working with game developers Shiny Shoe and Unity professionals, they eventually made it work. A few months later, the 29th of October would see the release of the Relics of the Past update, and significantly, this is when full voice acting for the game was completed and the game's world map was finalised. In traditional game development, most studios record all their audio once the game is complete, so it seems this was the approach they took, and considering all the rewrites that were needed, it was probably safer to do this at the end so they didn't have any more problems with voice acting. Most of the other changes in this update related to makeovers of existing biomes and again working on the game's polish, finalising item icons and removing ones that weren't needed. The game wasn't yet finished, but this is where Below Zero really started to feel like a cohesive experience, and the game's many strands were finally starting to come together. January 5th, 2021 would see price increases across the board for Below Zero and the original Subnautica. While Below Zero was in early access, the price was set at $20 to reflect its work in progress status. However, as the game moved towards completion, the price needed to increase to reflect this, and the price was raised to $30. This was always going to happen as part of the early access development model, but what's more interesting is the increase in price of the original Subnautica, from $25 to $30. The reason given for this was that the original Subnautica was going to continue to receive updates, but it was probably because of renewed interest in the title from the attention Below Zero was generating. Below Zero's final early access update ahead of full release came on the 25th of February, the aptly named Seaworthy update, where the game's final 54-track OST was implemented and the tiny loading bar Pengling was added. I think we can all agree that makes this the best update. They also supercharged the prawn suit, improving its jump speed and giving it the ability to boost when moving. This update also added controller and rumble support, even though the game wouldn't actually be available on console until the final release. The 13th of April would see the release of Below Zero's cinematic trailer. Made in partnership with Real Time UK, the trailer announced that the game would be releasing on all platforms on the 14th of May 2021. And when the 14th finally arrived, the game was officially released, adding the game's ending with the Architect homeworld and the game's full achievement list. Although that wasn't quite the end of the story, as even though the game was finished, Unknown Worlds would later add language packs on the 19th of August that year. And to many people's surprise, over a year later, another small update known as What the Dock was released on the 13th of September 2022, which added the much needed Seatruck dock along with other minor changes. Below Zero released to relatively good review scores and was even nominated for a number of Navigator awards in 2022, picking up the win in the special class category. Official sales statistics for Below Zero have never been released, but Video Game Insights, a website which estimates sales of games on Steam, seems to suggest it sold just over a third of what Subnautica did, which certainly isn't a disappointment considering its size and scale. So that was the development of Below Zero, and it seems like it was a little messy to say the least. My biggest takeaway from this is just how much the story changed while also not changing that much at all. Obviously, having already created so much of the game by the time the rewrites were made had painted the developers into a corner, so much of what was found in the final release is heavily linked to what had come before. Knowing what we know now, I can see why the final version of Below Zero has a bit of a lackluster story, but I'm still not convinced that changing direction so drastically was really the best idea. Fundamentally, the original story was never actually complete, so it's possible community feedback played a role in this change by judging something that wasn't finished. This is now just a matter of what ifs, but it does highlight that while there are great positives from the early access business model, it could result in decisions that maybe aren't always the best and taken with incomplete information, when really what they needed to do was to stick to their guns. Thank you again to Tom for answering my questions for this video. His first-hand account has really improved our understanding about what was happening at Unknown Worlds during this time and how we got to where we are today. Overall, I hope this experience has helped Unknown Worlds to learn valuable lessons for the development of the next Subnautica game. Either way, I'll be here to see how it goes. And if you're interested in hearing about how the original Subnautica was made, you can click right here to watch how Subnautica went from bankruptcy to brilliance. Just keep in mind it's one of my older videos, but I think you'll still like it. And special thanks to my patrons, Asmodeus Mateus, Graham DeLoye, Baron Windy and Immortal for making this video possible.